Hello. All right, so we're back. Oh my goodness, it is officially 1 month until the end of this semester. The weeks have just been flying by, folks. So I hope that you're doing well, and I hope that you had a good holiday, good Easter, and yeah. So the sun is shining and it's looking a little bit better. So maybe things will keep going in the right direction, the positive direction. So all we can hope for. Um, People are doing really great with the turn-in questions. That's awesome. People are also doing really great with the in-class questions. I think at this point you guys have got the modules figured out, and I think I've got them figured out. So hopefully you guys are getting everything you need from them as well. And the studio seems to be working as well too with these videos. So that's awesome. Yay, thank you to the IT guys at WNC, the IT people at WNC for doing that. So very cool. Quick little reminder, next week, so what is that, the 23rd, next class, will be your third and final quiz, okay? So it's gonna be just like we did 2 weeks ago. I'm gonna have the quiz available to you on that day from, whatever, I'll set it for 4:30 or whatever to 5:30. So in that window, that's when it will be available, okay? You will get your prerequisite, 15 minutes to do it. You may use your book, obviously, and you can look stuff up because I can't stop you from doing that. But once you click it open, remember the timer starts. So make sure that you get your reading done and everything else. Okay. Hopefully you're working on your projects. I've had a bunch of people contact me, which is awesome, which means that they're actually thinking about what they want to do, and they've been asking me great questions. So keep that up. If you have questions, please contact me. Don't wait till the last minute. Be working on that paper, and we're working on that project. Okay. And on my end, I'm going to be figuring out, what I'm going to be doing with your final exam, since I'm going to have to switch it up a little bit because of this whole thing, since we're not meeting. But I'll figure it out. Okay, folks. So we're going to get started today. We're just slowly working our way through these Middle Ages. They last a long time, so we're talking a lot about them. And each week we're adding something new and talking about something, adding something to stuff that we've mentioned, because this is in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinions, this is the time when European identity really starts to come around. What we started talking about last week was, the identities of these people. Okay, we took a little tour of France and England and Spain and Germany and these other places. We're gonna say we're not really gonna focus on the East, on Eastern Europe. So like places like Russia and things like that, because they get such a late start in comparison to the West. When it comes to the formation of kingdoms and monarchies and the feudal system, which is really interesting because it always, even now it seems like they're still, very behind the curve when it comes to, in comparison to Western Europe. Western Europe has always been on the forefront of new advancements, new technology, and changing in the ages. And so we're really going to focus on that, especially England as well, because without England we don't get America. Okay, so we're gonna pick up what I didn't get to last week, which is a little bit, but it is very important, and I want to make sure that we do talk about it. Then we're gonna move on to this next thing. Okay, all right. So last week we were talking about the Crusades, right? We were talking about a lot of stuff. Talking about the rise of the king, the rise of how you have in this early to high Middle Age society, how the king is slowly but surely, these not countries but kingdoms are slowly starting to form, starting to see that identity, and little bit by little bit the king is taking more and more power. But he still has a ton of nobles underneath him that really are the people that decide what's going on in that kingdom. And that is going to be the case for a while, until these kings slowly start to take more and more control over their own kingdoms. Okay. Last week we finished up talking about the Crusades. Okay. And we focused specifically on the First Crusade because, as I mentioned, the First Crusade, it's the First Crusade, and it's really the only crusade to a large degree to be militaristically successful. Okay, um, it it had the idea, the impetus behind it was to go and recapture the Holy Land, right? And it did do that. Um, the Muslims that were there, the Caliphate that were there, they did not really know what hit them. The Eastern Empire, Eastern Roman Empire was reeling. The Byzantine Empire was reeling. They sent off, right, the emperor there, Alexius, sent off, hey, to the Pope Urban II, can you send some help, maybe 200-300 knights? Well, Urban went about 8 steps better than that, and he ended up gathering together an army of over 40,000 people that flooded over to the east. They were successful in retaking the Holy Land, and we saw the formation of the Crusader states. But the Crusades as a thing, as events, and they last for hundreds of years after that first one in 1099, right, the turn of the 11th century. Militaristically, it has success right at the beginning, but then afterwards, the Crusader states last for about 200 years, which, well, yeah, about 200 years. So I guess militaristically, that was a success, but they slowly start to get picked off, these Crusader states. It does take 200 years, so that's pretty good. But each crusade after that, the second one and the third one and all that, they don't reach that pinnacle of achievement that the First Crusade does. And there's reason for that. We're not going to go into all those reasons because it's not a military history class. But for the most part, the Crusade does successfully do one thing well, and it was totally something that none of these people were thinking of at the time. This was a purely militaristic army, okay, under the guise of religion, okay? Like we talked about, many people have fought wars for different reasons. This one was a fight of Christianity versus Islam, okay? And then you have smaller minority religions like Judaism in the middle, caught between a rock and a hard place. That's how it goes. But this was a crusade, a war that was focused on spreading the faith and combating an idolatry, as Islam was considered by all Christians at the time. This was also a way for the Pope in Rome to expand his power even more. So basically, it's not like any king in France or England or something like that stood up one day and said, hey guys, let's do this together. No, they didn't have the capabilities. But there was one guy, the Pope, and since his agents, his people were all over the place, and since everybody in the majority of people in Western Europe and Central Europe were Christian, and there was only one church, remember, he was able to gather them together and basically say, look, you need to do this, okay? And now you have these new warrior priests like knights that are running off to do their thing, okay? And but militaristically, kind of successful. But why? What were the other reasons why it was successful? And that was these things, okay? So forget the guiding question for today. For right now, we're going to finish up with this right now. Okay, so as we kind of mentioned last week, the big thing that happens is that once again, you have an opening of the east to the west, just like we saw with the Romans before, and we saw with the Greeks, and we saw with Alexander the Great. You have finally an opening. It's almost like there's a big cultural wall that has stopped this. And sure, there's trading going on, but now that you have these Crusader states in the beginning of the 12th century, so 1100, you have a new expansion of trade going into Europe. Things that these people have never seen in their lives. Even the nobles are starting to see it, right? Silks and spices and all this amazing stuff coming from the east, and vice versa. A ton of stuff coming from the west to the east, okay? So the rise in trade and commerce was huge, as you can see by the different routes here. By sea, that was the biggest one, okay? And we're going to be talking about the rise of Genoa and Venice here a little bit later. But and then overland routes as well, okay? But that is not the only thing. So you see the rise of trade and commerce. But then you also see the rise of what? Of knowledge, okay? This is a new slash old knowledge, okay? So when the Muslims took all of this in the past, 600 years, when they start in the 600s, by the time you get to the year 1100, so 500 years, excuse my math, they've taken all this. Well, remember, this was all Latinized. This was all Roman before. And then you had the Greek influence as well. The Muslims that are taking these places over, like Egypt and North Africa and the Holy Land, they're not, just, taking this, these aren't just dumb barbarians, tossing like a bunch of knowledge into the ocean. They're keeping it and they're categorizing it, putting in their libraries and everything else, and then doing new ideas off of it. Okay, so if I took you back to the year 900, and went to some place like Alexandria in Egypt, you could go to some Islamic scholar there, and he would probably be versed in Greek, probably in Latin, and in Arabic as well. He would know people like Aristotle. He would know people like Plato. He would know people like Ovid, or whatever. And he would be translating those into the Arabic and everything else. So when the Crusaders come back, and this is all now open up, all that knowledge comes back with them too. So we see the rise of the scholar. Okay, so we see the rise of the scholar. Really, for the first time in European history, since the time of the Romans, you get the rise of a group of people. This is still small. It's not like all of a sudden there's new, elementary schools getting built all over the place. Absolutely not. The vast majority of people are still, illiterate peasants. They have no idea about anything except all the stuff we talked about with the peasantry. But you get a small number of what is called the scholar. Okay. This is a person that's been trained both in science. This person's been trained in literature and writing. This person's been trained in theology, so they know about Christianity as well. They're kind of a man of a jack of all trades. They know about all these different ideas and concepts. And we're starting to get new ideas and concepts floating into Europe as well, such as like anatomy. They're starting to learn, hey, it's still going to take a long time for them to totally figure out the body, but they're slowly starting to learn that, oh, look, if I take out this part of the guts, this person can't live anymore. Or what can we do to like set a bone? Or, they're even learning about doing surgeries on eyes and the brain and having the person actually survive. And that's pretty amazing considering that this was, 1,000 years ago. So we see the rise of the scholar, and this scholar is bouncing all over Europe. And they're going to these new places that are slowly starting to get a little bit bigger, okay? Like London, like Paris, like Madrid, like Aachen, the old imperial capital, Rome especially, okay? And they're spreading their knowledge, and they're studying with other scholars, and they're learning new knowledge, okay? And they're going around all throughout Europe, and they're doing their thing. They're teaching their stuff, okay? They're writing down new books, and they're writing down old information into these new books, and then think of new ideas, okay? I showed you this last week, but I said I'd get to it, so I will get to it. This guy on the left, his name was Peter Abelard. His name was Peter Abelard, and he was a scholar. He was the son of a smaller nobleman, and he grew up to be kind of like the whiz kid of his day. By the time he was in his 20s, he was known throughout France. And as this scholar, he was studying the liberales artes, or the liberal arts, all the things that like history and rhetoric and writing and, philosophy, the stuff that you study now. And so you can become a barista at Starbucks. But he was studying all those things, and he was going around and he was teaching. He had students, and then also to make money, he was doing tutoring sessions. He would tutor young nobles, right? He's not tutoring the peasantry, he's tutoring young nobles. One of the people that he tutored was a woman, and her name was Eloise, and she was the niece. Her parents were dead, and her uncle took care of her, and her uncle was a guy named Fulbert, and he was a church official. And she was, strangely enough, he wanted her to learn as much as she could, this is a time when women weren't learning anything. Most people weren't learning anything, especially not women, but she was. So she had studied math, and she had studied astronomy and all that stuff. And Abelard was sent in to help her as well. So he became tutor. He actually moved into Fulbert's house to tutor her, and well, it gets boring sometimes just doing your studies, and they ended up having an affair together. Her uncle found out about the affair. He split them up. He sent her off to a nunnery, and she didn't take vows. She wasn't a nun, but she was living with the nuns. He told Abelard, "Hey, hit the road, get lost, pal. I didn't pay you to be with my niece." Well, they saw each other in secret, and so this was considered one of the great love stories of the Middle Ages. They slowly saw each other in secret, had still continued the love affair. What happened? Well, of course, she ended up having a baby. She got pregnant. When this made it back to her uncle, well, he was really mad at this point. He's really upset. So, and this is true, he paid these guys, and one day they stormed into the place that he was staying in, and they held him down, and they actually castrated him, actually, as punishment, castrated him. He didn't die, but it was pretty savage punishment. And he forced them away from each other forever. She had the baby. It was a little boy. She ended up giving the baby away for like adoption, and she did stay in the nunnery for the rest of her life. And they never again saw one another. But he continued on with his studies, and he continued on with his travels. But we see people like that. We see people like Peter Abelard for the first time. There's a group of people that are running around and spreading the knowledge, this new knowledge. And for the first time, we're starting to see the rise of the universities, okay? Or universitatis, okay? And the universities start out as centers for religious thought, okay? Almost all of the great universities back in the day in Europe were like anterooms. They were built off of the side, or actually attached to, a religious institution. So it might be like a monastery or an abbey or something like that. The first original people that would be in that university would be religious people. They'd be studying theology, studying the Bible, studying Christ's teaching, studying religious law, concepts, all that type of stuff. Well, over time, as this new knowledge starts flooding into Europe, these universities slowly expand so that they're not just strictly religious institutions, and it's not only that religious people are going to it. Now, other people can go to it, just typical scholars. So, for instance, like Abelard, he was not a priest or anything like that. He was just a scholar. He studied at the university as well too. I believe he studied at the University of Montpellier down here in southern France. But the point is that these universities slowly lose their identity as religious institutions, and they slowly start to become this is going to take a long time, but they slowly start to become the institutions that we see now as a mixture of at the beginning, religion, so theology teaching, but then also now secular teaching. Okay, and what are these people learning when they go to the university? Well, they're learning all this new stuff, this new knowledge that's creeping around. That's now been pushed into Europe for the first time. Not only are they learning about the Bible and Christ, they're learning about all this stuff like history and philosophy and rhetoric and writing and and math and all the stuff that you learn in a university now. It's going to take a long time, but eventually the universities will separate once more. So you have strictly religious universities, and even those, like right now. So for instance, like in this country, we have like the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. It's a university founded by the Catholic Church, but you can go there and you don't have to study religion. You can study anything that you want. It's a typical university, and we're going to slowly see that with the rise of these universities. Now, these universities are very old. I mean, for instance, like Oxford. We've all heard of Oxford. Oxford up here in England. It was built in the early 1100s. So that university, if you go there now, you are, stepping in the footsteps of people that have been going and attending classes for the past 900 years. So these universities are very, very old, and they slowly start to spread throughout Western and Central Europe. If I showed you the same map on the east, they would be very, very, very few and far between. You can count them about on one hand, okay? There's like a university at Krakow in Poland, but that's about it. There's just nothing really that's developed in the East. Here's Krakow. There's really nothing in the East that you can see at this time, because these guys are just ahead of the curve. They're just ahead of the game, okay? But we see the rise of the universities, the rise of the scholar, the rise of this new, which is actually old information that is being relearned, okay, again. And we see the expansion of trade, right? We see the expansion of trade. So coming up to the high Middle Ages, Europe is really starting to flourish compared to what it was, 500 years earlier in like the Dark Ages, right? In the early Middle Ages. We're getting that new knowledge of the new trade. And then also, it's powerful. These kingdoms are growing more and more powerful, as we saw that with like the rise of the knight, and the rise of this idea that through Christian military action, you can harness the power of these warriors and sick them on the enemies of the church, and we're going to talk about that today as well. Okay, and then so here we have the professore, or the doctore, or the professor, sitting there talking to his students, the universities back in the day. So listen to this. I don't hear any of you complaining about, oh my God, this class is so boring. I have to sit in here for like 3 hours. I don't hear any nonsense, because back in those days, you would be sitting there for 13 to 14 hours with about an hour break to eat. You'd be sitting there for 13 to 14 hours. So you'd be sitting there about 9 o'clock in the morning until about 8 o'clock at night. You'd be sitting there studying. Now, here's the other one. You can't run down to the bookstore and go buy, your professor says you need these 8 books. It's not how it was. Books were extremely rare, extremely valuable, extremely expensive. So what happened? Well, since you were probably from a wealthy family or noble family, okay, because peasants aren't going to the university. There's no scholarship program, okay? You're going and you're bringing in your own paper, which is expensive enough, and guess what? While the doctor is sitting there talking to you, while the professor is sitting there telling you all this stuff that he knows about whatever, guess who's writing the book? You're writing the book. He's sitting there telling you about whatever, the anatomy, and you're sitting there writing down all of his words. That's what you're doing for 13, 14 hours in class. You're sitting there writing down his words. And then that's your notes, that's your book. You're gonna keep that for the rest of your life and study that. And then if you become a professor, same thing. You're gonna show your students what you have learned and everything else, okay? So you're sitting there taking notes after notes after notes, okay? So I don't hear any complaining about people saying, it's too many notes, I don't know what to do. You're not expected to write a book, okay? And then finally, folks, the last part of last week that we did not get to is in the high Middle Ages, we start to think and see something that we have seen like in movies and stuff like that, and that is the rise of the troubadour tradition. Okay, the troubadour was a troubadour. Okay, the troubadour tradition, it was a way for entertainment, but also for knowledge. Okay, so the troubadour would be like, usually it was one person, and then he'd have like an entourage with him, like a band or other people, other acts like jugglers, but they were the centerpiece, the musician. Sometimes the guy would be the singer. He'd usually be the singer and the songwriter, and he'd have a backing band. And what would they do? They would sing about the things that we think about in the Middle Ages: courtly love, right? Knights rescuing the fair maiden, fighting the evil enemy, whoever it might be. Could be like even a dragon, fighting, going on a holy quest to save the holy places, whatever it might be. And these troubadours would go to a place, a court, right, where a noble was or the king was, and the king or the noble would put them up for a couple weeks in their place, feed them, all that stuff, give them cash, and each night that's what you have for entertainment. The person would be sitting there singing, and there'd be other entertainment as well, singing, dancing. And also it was expected that you would write songs about your patron as well too, the person that was supplying you with your funds. You'd be writing nice poems about him, songs, whatever it might be. And so hopefully you've taken a look at the one that I sent you via YouTube. Some of them have survived, so it's really beautiful, really amazing. But yes, we have the idea of the troubadour tradition that well, gets started around this time. Okay, so that is it for last week. Now we're going to switch over to this week. Okay, all right, let me move this out of the way and bring up the new one. All right. My nose is running. Okay, folks, let me get my notes out here. This old stuff. Okay, moving on. So we're definitely heading down the road to the High Middle Ages here, and it's going to get us prepared and ready. We're already getting prepared and ready with the idea of, expanded identity, everything else, towards how the Middle Ages eventually end and how we get to the Renaissance, okay? But our guiding question for today is, how did the late Middle Ages continue to show the struggle between church and the state? And now, when I put up state, I don't want you to confuse the idea. It's just a way for me to put it up there really quick to show you the idea of, who's in charge, okay? But in the year 1100, 1200, there's no state like we have now, okay? There's no complete and utter bureaucracy like of the government. You have the king at the top, and you have his ministers, and you have the church all over the place, and then you have his nobles, like we talked about, right? With the idea of feudalism. Then you have the peasants all down at the bottom. So just for the sake of finding something to compare we have the church and the state, or the king. Okay, that's why I put that in parentheses. But then we also ask the question, how did the late Middle Ages continue to show the struggle between the state and the people themselves, okay? So when we talk about the reforms that we're going to see now, this is not really a reform for the people, okay? This is way too early for that. The people are going to have to struggle through, and they're going to have to be miserable for a long time before we start getting to the age of reason, and we start getting the age of revolutions, okay? But there is still a struggle between the people right underneath the king and the king himself, okay? And we're going to see how they dealt with that. And our main focus is on England, because they are the most distinctive when it comes to that, okay? But before we get that, we need to talk about this craziness that's happening up here on the screen. What the heck is going on here? Unfortunately, we see something that was all too common in the Middle Ages. It is a drawing of, a colorized drawing of people being, well, unfortunately burnt at the stake, okay? Being burned at the stake is a very terrible way to go. It is not quick and easy like getting your head chopped off. Being burnt at the stake was a very terrible thing. Obviously, it takes a while. The people that died from being burned at the stake, they did not die from immolation, from being burned alive. They died from smoke inhalation. But that did not mean that you weren't feeling everything until it got usually up to your knees or your thighs, okay? So why are they sitting there burning people alive, okay? Which, what could these people have possibly done that require such a terrible method of execution? Why not just chop their heads off, or, I don't know, throw them into a river or something, or even terrible. Yeah, that's terrible too. But what could these people have possibly have done, okay? So we see in the late 1100s or the late 12th century, that the church has figured out that this whole idea of a crusade is actually a pretty good idea. And it actually has worked very well. So the first crusade was a resounding success, right? It went over there, one man, the Pope, was able to say to all these people, hey, this is your duty as good Christians to go take back the Holy Land. And they did. They slaughtered thousands of people in the process, okay? But the church fathers realized that the act of crusade could be used in Europe as well, because going to Holy Land took a long time. It took years to get there usually, and you might not ever come back. But that did not mean, and that was where the main enemy was, for the Muslims. But that did not mean that there weren't already enemies closer to home. or actually in the home, okay? And so, but heresy, or the act of believing in something, heresy, or being a heretic, is the act of believing in something that is against the dogma of the Catholic Church, okay? The Catholic Church says this is how it is, this is how we teach it. If you either don't believe that outright or you believe it in a different way, well, according to Catholic Church at the time, that is heretical thought. You might still say, I'm a Christian, but if you don't believe in God, in Christ, the way that the Catholic Church is teaching you, well, that's a no-no. That's bad news. You can't do that, okay? And so the Catholic Church really starts, by the 12th century, really starts picking up this idea of fighting against heresy, heretical thought. Because remember, if one person thinks differently than you, who cares? Because it's just one person, and usually a person is considered a crackpot, an outsider, a weirdo. But if that one person successfully convinces 10 people, that his way of thinking is correct, well, it starts getting a little shaky. But if those 10 people now convince 100 people and so on, right? Now we have a problem. Because if a ton of people are now convinced that the Catholic Church is wrong, or that they're teaching us the wrong way of believing in Christ, now all of a sudden the Catholic Church has a problem on their hands. And if they don't stop it, it turns into a major problem. And so throughout the Middle Ages, these late Middle Ages, we see a crackdown on people that have differing opinions about the Catholic Church and about the way they're learning about God. There is no room for your own interpretation. The only interpretation is what the church is giving you, okay? And so we see a major crackdown on this, and we see that Pope after Pope uses this idea of crusade. However, here we go. The Catholic Church, we kind of have this idea that the Catholic Church, that this is just what they did for for whatever, a couple hundred years in the Middle Ages. That as soon as they found out that you thought about Christ a different way than they were teaching, that it was time to kill you and throw you on the funeral pyre. But that doesn't really make sense, does it? And the Catholic Church understood that. They understood that they couldn't just willy-nilly kill people. That A, eventually you'd start running out of people. B, you couldn't kill that many people. And C, if you just start murdering people that are going against you, eventually you'll slowly start to sway the opinions of the people who are with you but are against you just doing that, okay? So the Catholic Church, contrary to popular belief, was not just running around committing huge acts of violence throughout the Middle Ages, okay? That was just not what happened. It did get there. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, we have to understand, I always compare it to, an almost a religious metaphor as well, too. If you're a shepherd, right? So the shepherd in this case, the Catholic Church, and you have your sheep, which are the people of Europe. If there's one or two sheep that always continuously run off from the pack, and they're always getting into trouble, and they're always doing their own thing, you don't just go to that sheep and, chop off its hoof as a punishment, or, beat it as a punishment, or, to the point where it can't move, or just kill it as a punishment, because once again, you're going to run out of sheep if they all start doing that. And number two, you're not watching the other the flock, the rest of the sheep as well. And so the Catholic Church looked at the people throughout Europe kind of in the same way. So when let's say you were a guy and you're walking around in your village and you were saying things that were against what the Catholic Church is teaching. Eventually you would get back to the church fathers. Who is this guy? Oh, it's John down the street, and he's saying a bunch of weird stuff. They're not just going to kick open your door, and throw you on the funeral pyre. It's not how it works. You're going to be visited, probably by like the parish priest at first, just a regular guy, okay? He's going to show up and you're like, hey, John, I want to talk to you a bit, and he's going to try and explain to you why you're wrong. He's going to try and explain to you why the way you're thinking is all messed up, and he wants to move you back onto the path of righteousness, okay? Because he truly believes this too. He believes that if you keep going down this path, you've wandered off the path, if you keep wandering out in the woods, that is going to lead to the damnation of your soul. He wants to see your soul saved. He wants to see you eventually go to the kingdom of heaven. And by thinking these heretical thoughts, you're not going to do that. And so he's going to teach you, the right way of thinking about stuff. He's going to teach you the correct way, and he's going to show you why the Catholic Church's doctrines, why their teachings are correct. And then that's it. He's going to leave. Okay, and hopefully that's settled. If it doesn't work though, and old John down the street is still doing, their stuff, still thinking his stuff, but even worse, now he's telling other people about it. He's not just keeping it to himself, he's telling other people about it. Then they got to step up their practices a little bit. So this church father, this priest, will probably go up to his higher ups, and now they'll send somebody, one or two people down from like a higher level, like might even be an inquisitor. An inquisitor is a little bit rougher in their methods. They're going to bring you there. They're going to explain to you once again why you're wrong, and this time they're going to give you a warning, and they're going to tell you you need to stop this, or else there's going to be some severe punishments, and then that's it. And then people will either do it or they won't. If they don't, and they continue, to make a long story short, if they continue to keep doing the things that they're doing and going against the church has stepped up levels of punishment. Okay, so the very first one is usually ostracism. So we've learned about that word from the Greeks, that they kind of banish you from your village, from your family, from everybody. They don't like to do that too much though, because if a person is already an outsider, you don't want to ingrain his heretical thought by making him more of an outsider. You want to bring him back into the flock, right, to the fold. So the next thing that they would turn to is called public shaming. So what they would do is they would strip you of your clothes. You would wear this thing here, and I'll write down its name. So they would force you to wear this terrible looking thing. And this thing is called a cilice. And a cilice is it's a hair shirt. It's a shirt that is woven out of hair. Okay. Now, is it woven out of luxurious rabbit fur, so it's all nice and soft, and you could fall asleep in it? No, it's woven out of rough hair, coarse hair, like goat hair or horse hair. And those of you that have been around those animals know that, well, you don't snuggle up to a horse and you don't snuggle up to a goat. They have very coarse, very hard hair. And so when you wear something like that, it's not meant to feel good, it's meant to hurt. It's stabbing into you, it's rough, it's chafing your skin. Sometimes they even weave like sticks and things in there, so it's cutting you up a little bit. The point is that you're now that's all you're wearing. You're wearing this hair shirt. It comes down, or sackcloth, comes down to like your knees, so your private area is kind of covered up, but for the most part you're naked, except for that a little bit. And you're expected to walk from a certain area, usually to the church, and you're supposed to give penance, right? Now, do they have everybody stay indoors while you do? No, everybody's watching you while you do this. So it's a form of public humiliation, okay? It's a form of, of punishment. Like, this is what happens to people that go against what they should be doing. The other one that they do in the Middle Ages, and this one is really, you see this in Spain a lot, is they force them to wear the San Benito, or the dunce cap, as you can see, right? We don't use the dunce cap anymore, like in schools. But once again, it's just a form of public humiliation. Basically, like, we're going to embarrass this person to the point that they don't, that they recant their heretical thought and everything else. Okay. But eventually, moving on, if you continue to challenge the authority of the church, if you continue to say things or write things that are against what the church is saying, then we get to the severe punishments, okay? So then they start resorting first to mutilation, okay? So they'll, for instance, if you're writing bad things about the church, they might take that offending hand. They might, because here we have the inquisitor, right? You can always tell by the cap. They're taking off his hand. They might take out your tongue, or might take out an eye, or brand you, right, or chop off an ear. Some form of punishment that serves a couple purposes. Number one, it hurts, it's terrible. Number two, you could die from it. from the shock of losing this thing, whatever it is, because they're not gentle about it when they take out your eye or your tongue. And number three, it serves as a warning to everybody else that sees you. Everybody knows why your ear is now chopped off. Everybody knows why your hand is missing. You didn't lose it in some threshing accident. You lost it because you were writing bad stuff about the church or saying bad things, and now you're being punished, okay? And then at the very end, if it's still, this person still continues to do what they're doing, then we finally get to execution, okay? Execution. Excuse me. Now, an interesting thing about the church is that, once again, they were trying to bring these people back into the fold, and they used every method they could for doing that until they finally had to rely on, finally execution. Here's the thing, though, is, and this leads us into our next theme, the church, by their own laws, was not allowed to shed blood. So, you couldn't just, if you were a church, if you were a priest, something like that, you couldn't sit there and stab somebody's hand or something, like to torture them, do something terrible. They had other forms of torture, like breaking people on the rack, right? They stick you on the rack and they pull your arms and your legs out of your sockets, which is a horrible, horrible thing. But it's not shedding blood. They have other things where they're torturing you with burning, like the bottoms of your feet or your palms or something like that. But they're not allowed to shed blood. So what they would do is they would basically give you over to the secular authorities, the king or the nobles, and say, look, this person is a heretic, this person has we've tried everything we can, you need to take care of them. And the state was allowed to do these things. So when you see these things, the church is watching, but it's not the church actually doing it. It's actually the king or the nobles, whatever, that's burning you alive or, chopping your hand off, whatever it might be. Like this guy, he's being, it's called garroting. So they've got him attached to the stake, and there's a person that has wound, the executioner has wound a rope through a hole that's in the post behind him around his neck, and he's slowly twisting it and strangling the guy or break his neck. This is all done by the state, but as you can see, there's religious figures there watching, okay? So this leads us to our very next thing. And this becomes a huge, huge problem in the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, okay? So remember we talked about this fight before with the investiture controversy, right? So recap really quick, the investiture controversy is the idea, in a nutshell, who gets to appoint a church person in a kingdom? Is it the prerogative of the king, or is it the prerogative of the pope? Why? What's the point? What's the reason? Well, remember, whoever gets appointed is going to be in charge of this whole religious area, this diocese. And when those tithes come in, are those tithes going to the king and the kingdom? No, they're going to the Pope in Rome. So it's a huge amount of money that's being lost from these kingdoms. And these kings start to, hem and haw. They start to get angry. We talked about the story about Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, who actually gets excommunicated a couple times by the Pope at the time, Gregory. And he basically says, no, I'm the Holy Roman Emperor. I am the guy who's in charge. Yeah, you're pretty high too, Pope, but no, I'm the one who gets to appoint these people. And the Pope is saying, no, absolutely not. I am the anointed one on earth. I am God's anointed one. You might be the Pope, you might be the emperor, but you're only emperor because I said you could be the emperor. I'm in charge. And we get that battle between them until, remember, it gets solved kind of by his mama, the empress. Basically, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope appoints the people, but the emperor gets like a veto power over it, okay? Well, this continues out throughout Europe, okay? So, for instance, if we go to England, we have all these different dioceses, okay? Remember, these are the dioceses. Every diocese is run by a bishop, okay? And the bishop sends their money to their head, cardinal there in England, which is Canterbury, or in London, and then that person sends off the rest to the Pope, okay? But we run into a problem with this by the time we get to the High Middle Ages. And this problem is based off of ancient tradition, when we were barely out of the Roman times, okay? So I'm gonna write it down here. And the idea is called The two swords theory. Now, remember we talked about with the Romans. According to Roman tradition and law, ancient custom, you had that the Roman king, remember when there was a king before there was a republic, and then this goes on to the emperor, that the Roman king had the two different powers of the state. He had the auspicium, which is the ability to converse with the gods and kind of be their mouthpiece on earth. And then you had his power of imperium, right, or the ability to lead Rome's armies. This concept doesn't go away. In fact, it melds itself into something new, but the idea is still the same. They've just taken out, the Roman gods, and they've substituted the Christian God now, okay? Because there's only one God floating around now, and there's only one church, okay? This two swords theory, that's what it's called. This comes down to that there's two swords, okay? There's a Okay, there's two swords. There's a temporal sword, and there's an ecclesiastical or spiritual sword. And guess what? According to ancient Christian theology, both of these swords are granted from God to who? The Pope. Okay, he gets both swords. He gets the ability to be the spiritual leader. He gets the power of being the spiritual person, the king on earth, okay, over all the lives of all Christians. Underneath him. So he gets this sword. But he's also granted by God this temporal sword, or the sword that is ceremonial in leading kingdoms, okay? Well, according to the two swords theory, the Pope keeps this sword, the spiritual one. He is the supreme religious authority in Europe and on earth. But every Pope is granted kings the temporal sword, okay? Every Pope is granted kings as a way of showing benevolence to the king. So for instance, like when Charlemagne gets crowned, right? Remember, who crowns him? The Pope. So it's basically a ceremony, public ceremony showing, I keep this one. If I'm the Pope, I keep this one, this sword, but I'm giving you this one for now. And I have the ability to take it back anytime I want. You don't get to keep it what is that word? You don't get to keep it forever, okay? And I can take it back anytime I want. So for instance, just like with Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope at the time, Gregory, basically tells him, look, I granted you this, you're not upholding your end of the bargain, you're challenging my authority, guess what, I'm taking it away, I'm excommunicating you, I'm taking away that second sword. Well, this is all great if you're a member of the church. But if you're a direct member of the church, but if you're a king or an emperor, you don't like this. You don't like this situation at all. You don't like the idea that Jesus here has given both swords to the Pope, but this interpretation is basically here, Pope, you get this sword, and you king, whoever you are, get this sword. You like that one much better, okay? You like that idea much better. Because it basically says the Pope is not above you or beneath you, he's equal to you. Whereas the popes are saying, no, there's no equality here, I'm above you, okay? You're a king or an emperor, but I'm above you. The reason why this is a huge problem is because this Okay, the reason why this is a problem is because what this does, folks, see, like in our modern society, we don't have this. You can be part of a church, but the secular law, right, is what matters. You can choose to follow what not to follow in religion now, but secular law is the name of the game in modern society. In medieval society, you had two equal and strong laws in any kingdom. You had the laws of the king and the nobility and under feudalism, which are the secular laws, right? What the king demands, what the king wants. But then you also have the law of the church, canon law, what the church says is okay and what's not okay. Why is this a problem? Well, think about it, folks. How can you have a society that runs effectively, when there's two laws to obey? And I don't mean just like a specific law, I mean two different set of laws, two different codexes of laws. No society ever born can run that way effectively. Okay, it's happened, and it's happening in the Middle Ages, where the peasantry and everybody in that kingdom is expected to not only follow secular law, the laws of the kings and the nobles, but specifically the law of the king, but now also follow the laws of the church, right? It's asking too much of people, because in many cases, you don't know which law to follow, because one law might counteract a different law. So do you follow this side or do you follow this side? Okay. So a couple questions to ask yourself would be, if you're a person in this time, do I follow my church leader, right? What the priest is telling me, or the bishop, or do I follow my king and what the nobles are telling me? Because they might be telling me two different things. If a law counteracts, like I said, if a law counteracts one another, which one do you follow, right? If a leader is excommunicated, like with Henry IV, if a leader is excommunicated, am I expected to follow his laws still? Because now the Pope has said, nope, you don't have to follow him. He's been kicked out of the church. Okay, so can I tell that to his men when they show up and they're like, why didn't you do this? Like, well, no, you've been excommunicated, right? Do you see what the problem is? Do you swear allegiance to the Pope in Rome, or do you swear allegiance, right, your loyalty to your king, to your noble? And whose laws do you swear allegiance to? And then it's, if I follow my king, and my king is fighting against the Pope, am I a bad Christian? Am I going to burn in hell? Am I going to be punished? Am I going to be damned? If I follow the Pope, because I'm a good Christian, am I now a traitor to my king? Am I now, have I gone against my sworn allegiance to my king, right? It's kind of like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now this continues on for a while because nobody is willing to give ground. It's very rare that the kings are completely cowed by the church and they say they're willing to give up power. It just doesn't happen. They're a king or they're an emperor. Same thing with the Pope. The Pope is saying, I am in charge. I was like all popes were granted these two swords. I gave you one sword, now I'm taking it back. I am not going to relinquish power. I'm not going to share power with you. You follow me, okay? And so this is a huge problem, okay? So that is the two swords theory, the temporal sword, right? Rule on earth, rule in a kingdom, and the ecclesiastical or spiritual sword, right? The rule over people's spiritual lives, their souls, okay? But this leads us to two senses of the law in a kingdom, right? You have the secular authority by the king and his laws, and then you have canon authority by the Pope and the church that's there, okay? And so this leads to major confrontations between these two groups, okay? All right. There we go. So there we go. See the fight between the kings and the popes. There you go. All right. Okay, folks. So moving on. Getting a little bit more specific, and we're seeing the rise of the king as the major, powerhouse, the ruler here. Okay. We talked about the last week the real formation, the beginnings of these kingdoms, especially in Spain, France, and England. So we're going to turn back to England a little bit here, but also talk about France as well, because these are the two big powerhouses in Europe, along with the Holy Roman Empire in Germany at the time. Okay, in the year I think that this point in history with this group of people I'm going to tell you about is very interesting, specifically one person. Because every once in a while, when you're talking about history, especially ancient history or old history, you run into certain characters, certain people that are just they really break the mold of people at the time, and it's just fun to learn about those people. They're exciting to learn about. Okay, so in the year 1154, we see a new king of England. All right, this is his, it's hard to tell because it's 900 years old, but this is actually his sepulcher, or where he's buried. His body is inside here underneath these thousands of pounds of stone that have been carved to look like him. So there he is laying on his deathbed with his crown and his pillow, and he's got his sword there next to him, and inside there is his, is his mummified remains, okay? But in 1154, this new king is crowned, okay, of England. And he was born in France. Okay, he was born in France. He was already the Duke of Normandy, and we already have seen the connection between France and England at this time. Because remember, these kings are descended now from William the Conqueror, who was a French nobleman. He becomes the first real powerful king of England as we understand England, and he unifies all those counties and everything that are there. But this guy, Henry II, is his great-grandson, okay, through his mother's side. It's his great-grandson. So he's already the Duke of Normandy, and when he's 21 years old, in 1154, he becomes the next king of England. Henry II was a good king for the time. He was kind of like his great-grandfather. He was healthy, he was strong, he was dynamic. He was brutal in a time when you had to be brutal, but he was also conscientious about how the regular people looked at him. He did not want to become some tyrant that just randomly murdered people, because he knew that would just cause rebellion amongst his people all the time. And so he didn't do that. He was a military man. He lived in the saddle a lot, but he also ran his country as a king as well. So he would be back in court. He was politically savvy. He knew which palms to grease. He knew which people to get on his side. He knew which people to, keep an eye out for and do all this stuff, okay? His mother was the Countess of Anjou, okay? So when he becomes king, he's already has added this now, which is in modern-day France, Normandy, to the Kingdom of England. And he's also added all of this, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. All this goes to be with the Kingdom of England, okay? Like I said, he's a natural military leader, and he was ruthless to his enemies, but he knew when to relent a little bit. But he was also ruthless to his own family. We're going to talk about that. But no discussion about Henry II. So don't get your Henrys mixed up. We've talked about Henry IV, like I just did. Henry IV, who was the Holy Roman Emperor that we talked about earlier. This one is Henry II. He's the King of England. Has nothing to do with the Holy Roman Empire, okay? There's no reason to talk about him unless we talk about this person, because this is the person that is, well, she's pretty amazing when it comes to this time period. And this person will eventually become his queen, and her name is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay, she's an amazing, amazing woman, and I'm going to show you why here in a second. Okay, so Eleanor of Aquitaine is the eldest surviving child. She's a woman, obviously, of the Duke of Aquitaine. Now, if you look at Aquitaine, look at how much it controls. This is all in France, okay? Her father, I'll tell you his name, it's not really important. Her father was William X of Aquitaine. He was a very, very progressive man for this time period. We're talking about the early 1100s. Very progressive. He realized, after a certain amount of time that nobody else was coming. He had illegitimate children, but Eleanor was his oldest surviving legitimate child. And even though she was a woman, he still wanted her to be ready to run things when he died, because she was going to become the Duchess. So he provided a extensive education for her in a time when, like I said, women were not taught. They were not learned, in this stuff. There's no point. Women had, one reason to exist, and that was to produce babies. And when your wife died, you got married again and kept producing babies. But he did not see it that way, and he provided an excellent education for her. She was gifted in reading and writing, obviously. She knew Latin. She knew French. She was born in southern France, so she learned Occitan, or a form of French based in the south as well. She knew a little smattering of Greek, but she was studied in astronomy, mathematics, literature, all this stuff. She was studied in it, okay? So she was a prime catch for anyone that was gonna marry her. Not only was she brilliant and she had all this information, but look at all of the lands that she was gonna control, okay? So when she's 15, she is now Duchess of this giant area, okay? And she gets married to the Dauphin, the Prince of France, Louis VII, okay? So when she's 15, she gets married to Louis VII. So when his father dies, he will become Louis VII, the king. They get married when I think he's like 18 and she's 15, okay? Which is typical for the time period. But there's a catch in the marriage contract with the lawyers, good old lawyers. What they do, they basically say, that's great, Louis, but even when you become king, this whole area that's hers does not automatically go to you as part of her dowry. It will go to your son. It will go to the next king, okay? So it's hers forever while she's alive until she has a son, and then it will go to that son, okay? So Louis, you will not control that, but your son will, okay? This ruffles a lot of feathers. They don't like it, but it is what it is, okay? Louis is a dithering type of leader. He's not a very good king. When he becomes king, he's not really all, he's not a military man. He's not politically savvy. He's not terrible, but he's just not a great king, okay? The thing is that Eleanor, though, everybody likes her, right? The new queen. Right, there's a court, all the people, all the nobles that want to be around the king. But what happens is that there ends up being two courts in Paris, okay? And there's the court of there are people around Louis, and then there's the court of people who want to be around the queen, Queen Eleanor, okay? And this causes a lot of resentment. And what is she not producing? Remember, this is all her fault. It's always the woman's fault. What is she not producing that he desperately wants? She's not producing a son. That's what he needs. She ends up giving him two daughters, which are, princess royals, but he does not get the two sons that he absolutely demanding and wants. She's like, hey, whatever, I'm trying, sorry. And so the marriage is not very loving. It's a political marriage. When she's about 20, he joins the Second Crusade, and he says, okay, stay here. And this happened a lot. The men would tell the women, stay here, take care of things here while I go off to fight. And she basically said, no, that's not what I do. And so she's like, I've never been used to just staying at home and not doing anything. So she actually joins him. She raises men with him, and she takes off with him, and she marches on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. This is yet another point of contention between the two, because the rumors are floating around Europe and in the court that there's more people following her than following the king. He's kind of emasculated at this point, like basically they're coming not because of me, they're coming because of my wife, the queen. So there's still a lot of bad blood going. They make it all the way to the Holy Land. They make it to Jerusalem for a while, but the other Crusader states that got picked off by the Muslims at this point in the mid 1100s have stayed with the Muslims, and the Second Crusade is largely a failure. Okay, it's largely a failure. Like I said, the first one was really the only one that did anything. Okay, so she makes it back, and she still has not And years go by, and so now at this point they've been married for 15 years. She has still only produced 2 daughters for him. He has no son. At this point, she's 30 years old, and he's like 32, and they're not getting any younger. And so they're both pissed at each other. They both don't like each other, and they ask for a divorce, an annulment. And when you're a king and queen, the only one you can ask for that is not just your local priest. They go all the way to the top of the Pope. The Pope understands that the political ramifications of this is not working out. So, because remember, divorce was almost unheard of in the Middle Ages. Once you're married, that was it until somebody died. But he understands that this new prince needs to be born. Eleanor's not getting it done, and so he annuls the marriage on the idea of consanguinity, which means that they're too closely related blood, which is incredible because all of these religious families, or excuse me, all these royal families all throughout Europe, all the way to the present day, are basically all related to each other. Okay, they're all either 19th cousins removed or something. They're all related to each other, all these different houses. Okay, so what happens? She's no longer the queen, but the problem is that for him is that what happened? She took all this back. She's like, okay, and she went back to her duchy. It's 8 weeks later. That is it. 8 weeks later, she sends word to this guy. He's not the king yet. He is the Duke of Normandy. He is the Count of Anjou, all these areas here. He's this fiery young guy who will be the king. She basically says, I'm yours if you have me. And who's she talking about? She's talking about Henry II. Henry II looks at the map, says, yes. 8 weeks after her divorce from the King of France, she gets married to Henry II, so she loses being the Queen of France, and now she becomes what? The Queen of England. Now, here's the other crazy part. Henry is much younger than her. She's 30 years old. He, at this point, is 19. Okay, he's 19 years old. He's not even 20 years old at this point. She marries him, and in one fell swoop, now the King of England has all of England, and he's got more land in France than the King of France does. How do you think Louis VII feels about this? Well, he's noticeably upset. He's pretty pissed. But he can't just go fight wars against Henry II to take back this land or take it in the first place because, well, he's weak compared to this. So Eleanor brings all this into the new kingdom. And in the next 16 years of her life, 14 years of her life, what does she do? She does the thing for Henry II that you couldn't do, or that Louis VII couldn't do with her, and that is she provides children. So they have not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, okay, including 5, count them, 5 boys. The first son that's born, he dies as a toddler, so he does not last long. But then you get the second Henry here, then you get the third one born, Richard. Richard is her favorite. Richard is her favorite son, favorite child, and you know him as being Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. Richard hates being king. He does not want to be king when he finally becomes king. He wants to go fight, and he spends nearly 99% of his life campaigning, fighting across Europe and fighting in the Holy Land. That's all he does. In total, I think he spends about a year and 3 months of his entire life in England. Okay, all the rest is, he doesn't even speak English. He just speaks French and Occitan like his mother, and so on. After that, we have Matilda, we have Geoffrey, we have Eleanor, we have Joanna, and then we have the baby, and the baby is John. John is born when Eleanor is 44 years old. So she gives Henry II one last boy. Henry II is, this marriage is very conscientious as well too, because Mama will always side with her babies. And so what happens is, as these 3 get older, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, at one point I believe Geoffrey's like 16, Richard's like 19, and Henry is like 22 or 21 or something like that. What do? They want more power from their daddy, from Henry II, so they rebel against him. They fight against him. They start a war against him, and he's pissed. he doesn't look at them as like, oh, you're my sons now. He looks at them as like, oh, fine, you're traitors. And he fights them. He fights them all throughout France. He fights them in England, but mostly in France. He ends up destroying all their armies and taking them all prisoner. He basically throws them all into prison for short periods of time. Who does Eleanor side with? Well, Eleanor sides with her babies. She sides with her children. And to punish her, he's like, you know, you are my queen and you're a pain in the ass and you shouldn't have been fighting against me. He actually imprisons her. He imprisons her for 16 years. And he never visits her for those 16 years. He now, it's not like he throws her in a dungeon like some, you know, peasant. He puts her in like house arrest in this beautiful big giant castle there. But she can't leave under penalty. Her children go to visit her. Who is Henry's favorite? Henry's favorite is the only boy that doesn't rebel against him, and that's the baby, John, because John is a little boy when all these battles are going on. Eventually, Henry dies of disease, of fever, and so the crown will go to Richard at one point, okay? And Henry was constantly fighting. He was fighting with his nobles. He was fighting with internal revolts. He was fighting in France to expand his lands in France. He was fighting against his children. He was fighting against his wife, Eleanor. And Eleanor, once again, was a pretty amazing person. The last things I'll tell you about her is that she ended up surviving every one of her children. She survived every one of her children. This is, I've told you before, this in the Middle Ages, life was short, right? Life was did not last very long. And that she was still having babies into her 40s was an incredible feat of this woman's like health and constitution. Because remember, they had no concept of cleanliness or anything like that. So when you had a baby, it opened you up to a disease and everything else. But she had 8 babies with him, plus her 3 babies with Louis. She had the 2 daughters, plus another son who passed away as a baby. But she had many babies. She lived to be, I think, 81 years old, if I remember correctly, 81 years old. She outlived all of her children. She outlived Henry. She outlived Louis. She outlived everybody. And what did she do? So like when Richard becomes king, the very first thing he does is he rides over to that castle and he lets Mama out of prison, okay? He brings her back. And so when he's off, he's like, okay, thank you. He sticks her in London and he goes, okay, I'm gonna go off and go fighting again. She goes, okay, great, honey. And she basically rules England as the queen. She's the queen mother. She's in charge. And eventually, John, when Richard dies in campaign, John the baby, because Geoffrey dies as well too, John the baby will become king, and we're going to talk about him on the next part. But Eleanor is a mover and shaker all the way up to her dying days. Even when she's 80 years old, she's outlived all these people. She's still bouncing around between Spain, France, England, all these places, trying to make political matches for her children, her grandchildren that are now adults. She's making, she's doing this thing. The whole thing about courtly love and the troubadour tradition, she loves that stuff. And so we see a large portion of that in the Duchy of Aquitaine. We see, that wherever she is, she brings in like scholars and she brings in writers and she brings in musicians and everything else. And we see this newfound expansion of knowledge surrounding wherever she is. But she was just an incredible, amazing woman, that really bucked the trends of her time. Yes, she was a noblewoman, and so obviously she had a lot more sway than just a common woman, regular peasant woman. But this is a time when no women had really any rights, had no say in anything, and so that she was able to do this is pretty incredible. Really a testament to who she was. And so this is going to be this is going to be the start of the confrontation between England and France for the next 100+ years. England will keep fighting to keep what they have in France, and France will keep fighting to take what they believe is theirs, what used to be theirs hundreds of years ago, like the Carolingians and everything else, okay? But to wrap up today, wrap up this first part, is Henry, going back to Henry, is his confrontation with the church, because Henry was no different. Yes, he was fighting all these political enemies, but he was also fighting the church. So we're talking about Henry II. So just like Henry IV over the Holy Roman Empire earlier, 50 years earlier, Henry II, like all these other kings and nobles, are fighting the church as well. Based on what? Remember that term, investiture. He doesn't know how to solve this problem because there's no way to solve this problem at the time. Who gets to appoint these religious people in my kingdom? And England's no different. They're part of the Catholic Church as well. The Pope is telling Henry II, like, I don't care how great of a military person you are, you still are subservient to me, you're still subservient to the church. You do as the church commands, you do as the church wants, okay? Henry spends, he's constantly fighting, and he's fighting against the church as well, because he doesn't want to give that type of power and authority to somebody that's not even in his kingdom. And so he's constantly fighting. Now, in England, let me get back to the thing. Where is it? Oh, it's so far back. In England, so remember, here are the dioceses in England, and the biggest, most important places, there's two of them, okay, in England. Number one is London, or obviously because it's the capital, the major area. But the second most, well, the first most holy place is this place, right here on the tip. It's called Canterbury, and there's a big cathedral there. So this is not just a regular little church, it's a giant cathedral. This is one of the spiritual places, most holy spiritual places in England. Stemming all the way back to when England first became Christianized, when it first was converted to Christianity. And so this giant cathedral was built there. And the person that's in charge of this cathedral was called the Archbishop. Okay, so like he is a step above, like he's kind of like the English version of the cardinal. Okay, he's above all of these bishops and priests that are there, but he's obviously below the Pope. He is the head spiritual advisor in England, okay, and he answers only to the Pope. Okay, he doesn't answer to the king. He has to give deference to the king because it's the king, right? He's a loyal subject of the king. But once again, we're conflicted. Who do I owe more allegiance to? The Pope, by the Holy Father, or to the king, okay, to the person that's, right there north in London. And Henry, is fighting with the Pope. He believes, he's like 50 years old at this point. He's been fighting with the popes over his whole reign as king. And he believes he has a great solution to this problem. At one point, the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and he knows this is going to be a big confrontation. Basically, the Pope's going to want to step in and say, okay, here's the next guy who's going to be the Archbishop, and all that money's going to go to Rome. He believes he's figured out something different, and he's figured out an end around the Pope. What he did was he went back to one of his very, very good friends. Okay, he went back to one of his very good friends. This guy had been a partier with him. They had partied when they were young. He had been on campaign with him. He had fought with him, and they were very, very good buddies. They were very, very good friends. And his name was Thomas Becket. Okay, so Henry says, "I got this perfect idea, Thomas. I'm going to invest you, my good buddy, as the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm going to raise you up to this position. We're going to, go right past the Pope's authority, and you're going to be in charge. And you're going to spread my leadership abilities. You're going to, focus the people's attention on me, not on the Pope, right? I want you to start focusing the people's allegiance more so to me as being their spiritual authority, not only their temporal leader, but their spiritual authority here as well too, and you as well, because you're going to be the Archbishop, okay?" And Thomas is like, "Yeah, this is great plan, awesome," because this is a huge advancement. I mean, Thomas Becket is not going to be living in poverty. He's going to be he's the Archbishop. He's going to be living with nice clothes, going to have a nice house. He's going to not really have to work. And so Henry believes, and the Pope is stewing at the time. The Pope is so upset. He's like, "You don't get to do that." And Henry's like, "I did." So what are you going to do about it? And he believes he's got this figured out, because now, remember, all that money is going to stay in the kingdom. But then something happens along the way, and this happening can only be attributed to, well, people change, and we never know when we're going to change. And over time, it's impossible to say. Over time, Thomas Becket, who's now the Archbishop, he has a change of heart. He's there doing his job as the Archbishop, administering to the poor, administering to the bishops and the priests and everything else that are in his in the kingdom. And at some point, he stopped being the king's friend and party buddy and started being this person that he's supposed to be, this spiritual leader in England. And when that gets back to Henry II, because Henry II's giving him orders, hey, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, and Thomas Becket starts saying, well, let me converse with the Pope, see what he thinks. And Henry's like, no, that wasn't the plan. You're supposed to converse with me. And he goes, well, I need to converse with the Holy Father. So over time, we start seeing that Thomas Becket starts to take his job as this Archbishop seriously, that he starts to, focus on doing what he's expected to do. This is his duty, his role. And this infuriates Henry to no end. He's already, like I said, fighting against his kids. He's fighting against all these other problems. And he's like, oh my gosh, now this thing that I thought was this great, massive political coup against the Pope, it's backfired. Now my buddy has betrayed me, and he's done what I didn't want him to do. I could have just put anybody in there and to do the same thing, to challenge me. And so, the story goes that he's like pacing around the palace. He's upset, and he's just thinking about this. Not only has he lost this battle with the Pope, or losing this battle with the Pope, but he's lost this good friend, this very good friend, because Thomas Becket will not acquiesce to his demands. He will not come back from it. And so, as the story goes, he's wandering around the palace, he's doing his thing, and he just kind of says out loud, it's never really been made clear if it was an actual order, or if it's just his like musings, or if it was him, just talking to himself. I think it was a little bit of all those things. But he basically says, would somebody rid me of this troublesome priest? I wish something would happen to this guy. Well, it just so happens that, there's a couple knights that hear the king say that, and they understand that, if they do what the king wants, that they're going to be benefited, that they're going to be, respected, or whatever it might be. And so what do? They hop on their horses, they ride to Canterbury there, and these are knights. These are, remember, they've taken oaths in protection of religion, of the Pope, but they've also taken oaths in protection of the king. And what do? They ride in there. They go into the cathedral, and there's Thomas Becket on his knees praying, doing his thing, and they kill him. They pull out their swords and they kill him. And all hell breaks loose. It's a very terrible situation, because he's unarmed. Obviously, he's not wearing armor or anything else like that. He's an old man at this point. He's like in his 50s, and he's just sitting there praying. He's completely defenseless, completely helpless. They run in there, they slaughter him, okay? They just butcher him, and they ride off, and they ride back to London, and they tell the king, hey, you know what we did? And he's just beside himself. He's like, you did what? He cannot believe that they did this, because he knows that this is going to be a huge blow up against him, and it is. Everybody immediately switches, basically the focus is now against him. Like, this is a tyrant king. This is a terrible person. He had this guy murdered, and he was murdered. It's not like they murdered him on the way home. He was murdered in a holy place. This is consecrated ground. This is one of the most consecrated pieces of land in England, the cathedral in Canterbury, and he murdered him, right? And he couldn't even do it himself. He had these other guys do it, and so he knows he's in a world of what. The Pope hears about it, immediately said, draws up, excommunication, like, I'm kicking you out. This is it. I'm going to have everything taken from you. Like, all the lands will always become like permanently part of the church, everything else. Henry understands that he screwed up bad. And so what he does is he does that thing, same thing that we saw. He wears a hair shirt. Now, this is a king. This is the king of England. This is some, like, the carpenter working down the street. This is the king of England. Wears the hair shirt. He wanders through the street, barefoot. And here's all the subjects watching the King of England, right? This great warrior. While Eleanor's off, being imprisoned somewhere, he has to wander to to the cathedral, and he lays down and he prays and he lays down as a penitent. He's giving penance, right, or asking forgiveness from from God, from the Pope, everything else, and he has to lay there, and he does it for about a day, and he's not kicked out of the church. But once again, this shows this continuation, this continuing fight between the secular authority, the king and the queens and the emperors, with the papacy. And we're going to see that this is going to keep being a problem, keep being a problem, keep being a problem. Okay, especially as we keep going higher into these, well, further on into these high Middle Ages. Okay, so that's the end of part one, folks. We're going to start with part two. Make sure you're getting everything watched, writing your notes down. If you have any questions, like I said, please contact me, okay? All right.